Hello and welcome to another video. This is the first video in a series aimed at introducing beginners to Autodesk Bifrost. So if you're mainly just an artist and you've got little or no knowledge of scripting or programming, you might look at Bifrost and you want to get into it and start using it, but you may find it just a little bit intimidating. So this video and others like it are going to be aimed at you. And the reason for that is I looked at some of the tutorials out there for Bifrost and they're very good and they cover some really good topics, but they still can be very intimidating to the absolute beginner because sometimes they just have an assumed knowledge on the viewer. So what I wanted to do is really take things from a very basic level and build up the knowledge and competency with each video, and then gradually over time you'll begin to experience Bifrost, get to know more about it, and then hopefully you can then do your own stuff inside Bifrost itself. So I guess a good starting point would be now to ask the question, what is Bifrost? Well, Bifrost is a visual programming environment and framework that allows artists and TDs to create complex and procedural effects using a graph editor. And this is something that Autodesk have been working on for quite some time. And they've taken a very long and varied journey to get to this point, really. And that kind of started back in 2008 when they acquired Softimage. Now, Softimage had introduced a new technology to their 3D package called ICE. And that stood for the Interactive Creative Environment. And that too was also a visual programming framework. But it was groundbreaking at the time because it was one of the first proper examples of a node-based visual programming system inside a 3D package. And it was also built to be multi-threaded, which means it could take advantage of multi-core processors which were appearing on the market for the first time. And with the exception of SideFX's Houdini, there was nothing else out there really like it. And it proved to be very popular with the users and the community. And there's lots of videos and examples online where you can see the type of stuff that people were building with it. And it also predates many of the visual node-based systems that we see today, including blueprints in Unreal. Now, despite a lot of work, Autodesk couldn't really make ICE work outside of Softimage. So we need to fast forward now to 2012, when Autodesk acquired a company called Exotic Matter. And they were the makers of a popular fluid simulation software called Naiad. And at the time, there was a lot of speculation as to the future of Naiad. But a year later, at SIGGRAPH, the team emerged with a short tech demo that appeared to have everything that Naiad had, but combined with maybe some influences from Softimage's ICE. And that accumulated into a project codenamed Bifrost that appeared to do fluid simulations, but also a whole lot more. Now, despite appearances, Autodesk were very clear to point out that this wasn't just a Naiad version 2.0, and it wasn't really ICE 2.0 either, but it was something entirely new. And it was standalone, which meant its architecture was completely independent of software like Max and Maya. However, if you look at it, it did look like that Naiad and ICE had somehow come together on a whiteboard, and then Bifrost was basically the result of that. So then a year later, in 2015, we get the first release of Bifrost in Maya, which was very simple for the time, had very basic functionality, just creating fluid sims using a flip solver, and that was really about it. It didn't have any proper nodes in there or a nodal graph workflow. But eventually, over time, they've worked on it more and more, and then in 2020, we got a proper graph editor in Maya, and now with the latest version of Maya 2022, we've got a fully functional graph editor, and we can really start to really dive into Bifrost and do some really cool stuff with it. So at the moment, we can only use Bifrost inside Maya. However, the key thing to remember here is that it's still actually standalone. So the architecture does sit outside of Maya, and in the latest version of 3ds Max, the fluid solver in that software is based around Bifrost, and Autodesk have already kind of teased people with a short video showing the Bifrost graph editor inside 3ds Max. So at the moment, it's purely speculation of what's going to happen with that, but it would seem to indicate that eventually we might get Bifrost into 3ds Max. However, all we've got is Maya, so that's what we're going to basically use for this video and also the subsequent videos as well. Now, because Bifrost is kind of standalone, it's actually a plugin inside Maya, and that plugin gets installed by default whenever you install the main version of Maya. But because it's a plugin, it also means that it can be loaded and unloaded independently. If you go to your plugin manager, you'll see it here listed in amongst everything else. So in order to use Bifrost, you have to ensure that all these plugins are actually loaded. But at the same time, if you want to unload them because you don't need to use Bifrost, then of course you can just make sure they're not loaded and it's not going to be appearing inside your software. But the advantage of doing this means that the team can essentially run independently and deploy their versions independently of the main core version of Maya. If you go to the area community site from Autodesk, there's a Bifrost landing page, and you can actually download Bifrost for Maya independently. And that's really useful if you're running an older version of Maya, because it's very common for people not to update to the latest version straight away. They could be in the middle of a project and they're just not able to update straight away, but they can still use the latest version of Bifrost. And you can see here that we can download the current version for 2022, but also for Maya 2020 and also 2019 across all the supported operating systems. If we look at the release notes as well and go back to the Maya documentation, you can see the type of versions they've got as well. And you can see how at the moment they've been updating Bifrost independently, but in line with the point releases. So the main 2022 release of Maya has got down to Bifrost 2.2.10, but then in the 2022.1 point release, there's an update and also another update in the 2022.2 release here. And again, we can look at the documentation and see what's actually all in there. And again, you can even look at the previous versions as well and really go back to quite some way. So this really makes the whole thing a lot more flexible for people as well. It's very much like what they do with Arnold, where the Arnold versions aren't necessarily in a line with Maya, and they can essentially run at their own pace and deploy updates when they need to. We know that Bifrost in Maya is a plugin, so the first thing that you must ensure is that that plugin is loaded correctly. So go to your plugin manager and make sure that one, you've got the Bifrost module here in your list, and two, that you've got them all loaded. If you don't have it in your list, then you're going to have to go to Autodesk's area webpage, go to the Bifrost landing page, and you should be able to download Bifrost separately and install it. And then once you've got it installed, activate the plugin. So now you've activated the plugin, how do you access Bifrost? Because it's not exactly very clear in the UI as to how you sort of fire it up, how you start with it. Now, there's different access points depending on what it is you want to do with Bifrost. I guess the first and most obvious thing that you might notice is the Bifrost shelf. And you've got a number of different options here, which I'm not really going to go into. There's just real two main sections here. You've got these kind of shortcuts, which are pointing to things like aero solvers and emitters and so on. And that's to do with Bifrost fluids. And then you've got these two options here, which are to do with the content browser and also the Bifrost graph itself. So I'm just going to bypass these for a moment and instead focus on other parts of the UI. Because if you're looking at these menu items, there's nothing here that really resembles Bifrost. And even when you start flipping through some of these modules, you won't see anything to do with Bifrost, except when you get to effects. And here you'll see two menu items which are directly related to Bifrost. First one is this one here, Bifrost Fluids. And the second one is this boss menu. These two menus represent essentially Bifrost Fluids in Maya. The first one here, which is obviously called Fluids, that's the main simulation system for creating fluid and any kind of fluid effects, like liquid, emitters, controlling with gravity, interacting with objects, etc. The second menu, Boss, is the Bifrost Ocean Simulation System. This system lets you create realistic ocean surfaces with waves, ripples and wakes. And you can combine these two together to create all those demo scenes where you've got essentially water crashing against rocks and foam is being generated and etc. Or you've got an object or a ship going through what looks like water and it's generating a wake. You can do all of that with these two menus here. I'm not going to go through all of these essentially because these are all documented, and we'll probably cover this in another video. But one thing to also notice as well is that you can pull up some examples here as well. Under the Bifrost Fluids menu, there's a Get Example option. If you select this, this will bring up the actual Maya content browser, which is where all the kind of sample and demo scenes are contained. And there's a section called Bifrost Fluids. And this is where you can import these into your scene. Now, these are loaded in the same way any other samples are. You click it and you can sort of right click it and import it in. And when you import it in, you'll get a whole load of nodes in here, which you probably might not going to understand. And I'm not going to try and play any of this back because none of it is cached correctly and it probably won't work straight away. But we can cover this in another video. But if you want to load any of this stuff up and then start caching things out, then you can do so. And it's not a bad way to start if you're looking at diving into Bifrost Fluids, but it might be a good idea just to take your time with it because it takes a while to decipher what some of these things are actually in your scene. Now, much of the stuff here is documented, so it's definitely worthwhile not trying to skip all that and actually taking some time to go through some of the documentation, because it often explains about how to import a demo scene, previewing a Bifrost simulation with the scratch cache and how to make it work, because most people will load this scene up, press play and then expect it to work, and it'll go really slow and they won't understand why, because basically there's a lot of computation that has to happen here for it to actually work. But if you spend a little bit of time on here and make it work, then it will play back perfectly fine. But we're going to skip over this anyway and not go through this right now, and we can always cover it in another video. So I'm going to reset Maya now and just start with a whole blank scene. And I'm just going to keep these menus open here. Now, the next thing to look at in terms of Bifrost is two other menus, and that's the Create menu and also the Windows menu here. And these have got two options here. One is called Bifrost Graph under the Create menu, and the other one is called the Bifrost Graph Editor and also the Bifrost Browser. So what do these actually do? Well, first off, we'll deal with the Bifrost browser, because this option is also available here on the Bifrost shelf under this option here. If we click this, what this will do is it will open up the Bifrost browser, which will contain any number of demo scenes, all of them covering all the current capabilities of Bifrost in Maya. And there's lots of variety here. They've all been categorized into different things. But you'll notice that these are a little bit different from the Bifrost Fluid stuff that we just saw a moment ago, because this is being loaded via the Maya content browser, and this browser is specific to Bifrost. But it looks like that at the moment Autodesk haven't populated this Bifrost browser with any of the fluids, and they're still kept separately. But just as with the fluid examples, these examples here are all able to be loaded up. And again, they're not a bad way of just starting to play around with Bifrost and experiment with it and just see what's going on and kind of how it actually works. And there's some really good examples here as well and how they all work. And many of these are also documented as well. If you load any one of these up, for example, just click on it and just click the import button. This will load it into the scene, and you'll notice that the graph opens straight away. It's annotated, and you can start going in here and then exploring it and noodle around with it if you want to. So that's the Bifrost browser. Then next thing we've got is under the Windows menu is the Bifrost Graph Editor. So if we select this here, this window will appear, and this is exactly the same option that you would get if you selected this option in the shelf. So you've got Bifrost Graph Editor here and Bifrost Browser here. Now, this seems to be essentially the main access point into the Bifrost Graph Editor, because you've got a very simple welcome message here, and you've got three options. You can create a graph, you can access the Bifrost browser, and also there's a link here called Getting Started, which will take you to a whole array of Bifrost tutorials on Autodesk's area community website. So this is really, I guess, the main starting point, because you can create a graph, and when you do that, this is what gets created, and straight away in the outliner you now have a Bifrost graph object in your scene. And I can close this and also just remove this at any time. Then finally, the last option is under the Create menu where you can actually create a Bifrost graph. And if you select this, this bypasses that main welcome window, and it just creates the graph straight away. And you'll see that here's my graph, there's the nodes, and the Bifrost graph object has now appeared in my outliner. So that's really the basic difference. And again, if you notice when I delete the graph there, it's been deleted and it defaults back to this welcome screen inside the graph editor itself. If you already know what you're doing and you just want to start with the graph, then you go to the create menu and just create a Bifrost graph. And that will create a graph that's either empty or related to an object that you may have previously selected. Now, one thing I've also noticed as well is that you can actually start to create graphs from the actual graph editor, even if you've got nothing else in your scene. So for example, if we actually bring back the Bifrost browser, and let's just re-import that example again. Now you notice the Bifrost graph editor is open straight away. And if I close the browser, we don't need the fluids anymore, so we can close that, and also the boss, so we can close that as well. We're not going to use create, so we're just going to focus on the editor itself, so we don't need this anymore. So this just closed the graph editor, so then I've got nothing else in my scene now. And even if I deselect everything, so I've got nothing else selected, if I now choose Bifrost graph editor here from the Windows menu or from the shelf, it will automatically load up the Bifrost graph that's in my scene, irrespective of whether or not I've got any other objects in my scene. So if I was to close this and just say create a whole bunch of objects and in my scene, even if I deselected them, graph editor again, it will detect a Bifrost graph in my scene and automatically load it. Now, if I was to have multiple Bifrost graphs in my scene, which is very, very possible, and this, I'll just use any one of these and just import them in. And again, it automatically opens up. So again, we can close that down. So now I've got this object here, which is Bifrost graph, and then this object here. If I deselect them, now if I open up the Bifrost graph editor, it doesn't actually open up a graph. Instead, it actually goes to this welcome screen and shows me what graphs are in my scene, so I can choose which one to actually open. And the reason for this is because it doesn't make an assumption as to which graph you want to open. It's just giving you the choice. So again, I can choose any one I want and open that. But also, if I want to open the other one as well at the same time, then I can do that here. There's a little plus symbol. If I click that, it will give me an option between opening up the other Bifrost graph or choosing an entirely new graph here. So I can choose the smoke plume, and then I can also create an entirely new graph. And once I've got that, you'll see the Bifrost graph node has actually been created here. So essentially, I guess the main starting point, if you're beginner, is the Bifrost graph editor, either from the shelf here or from the Windows system. I would perhaps leave this create menu alone, because you can essentially do the same thing via this graph editor as well. And you can close this down. You can close any one of these graphs down. There's a little X next to each tab where you can cycle through. So again, I can just quickly close them. And as soon as I close everything, it defaults back now to the welcome screen. And now, of course, it's detected 3 graphs in my scene, and I can choose whichever one to open up when I want to. Now, another thing to mention here is the differences between what is created with the Bifrost graph and also what is created via the Bifrost Fluids menu. So let's just say, for example, I just create a basic liquid emitter here, or even aero, it doesn't really matter. If I click this and I've got my objects here, but if I bring up my graph editor, they don't appear in my list, and there's no way to actually create them here either. So what's going on here? Why can't, if this is Bifrost liquid, why aren't they appearing in this Bifrost graph editor? Well, I believe the reason for that is because the options here that are available as fluids, they are kind of regarded as legacy now, because they came about when Bifrost was first being implemented into Maya. So although these are very good and you can do some great stuff with this, the team haven't retrospectively made it work with the graph editor. What you can do if you wanted to is bring up the standard Maya node editor here via the Windows menu, node editor, and you can see that there are a few nodes here to do with the various graphing if you want to, and you can begin to explore them here, although this perhaps isn't as intuitive as using the new Bifrost graph editor. So you could say that many of the effects here are very self-contained and not really accessible. However, there are ways in which you can make these nodes here talk to the graph editor, and also with the new graph editor here and also its functionality, you can begin to build up liquid, particle and error effects with this new Bifrost graph editor. So I think what the team have decided to do is not focus on trying to fit in the legacy stuff. They've left it there, they've left it accessible, but going forwards, you're going to want to start doing stuff via the graph editor as well. And you can make these menus talk to each other very, very easily. And there's various ways in which you can query the emitter, you can connect to the mesh shape that's being generated, and then plug it into your graph editor to create all kinds of different effects. But it's something just that it's worth being aware of in case that you create a liquid effect with Bifrost and you're wondering why it's not appearing in this new graph editor when everybody's telling you that you should be using the graph editor. Now, before we wrap up this first video and move on to our first tutorial, I just want to spend a few moments exploring the functionality of the graph editor, because we're going to be spending a lot of our time here. I'm not going to use Bifrost Fluids up here or the create menu. I'm just going to go straight into graph editor each time, and I'll probably use the shelf to access that, and also the Bifrost browser. Now, we know that because we don't have a Bifrost graph in our scene, when we open up the graph editor, we get this welcome message with these three options. We can create a graph here, or we could do it up here in the create menu, new graph, or we could choose the little plus symbol here and also create a graph there. Now, once we create a graph, all these kind of menus and windows start to become live, you might say, or they're activated. So on the right side, you've got a very simple panel here that's got parameters and information. So I guess when you select input here, you've got some basic parameters that you can control, a bit like the attribute editor. And also there's an information panel here, which is designed to explain some basic information about the node that you've actually got selected. And when you select a node, you'll notice it's got a white outline. So you can just click once to select it, and then left mouse click and drag to move it around in your actual graph. The navigation is very simple here. We can mouse wheel out to zoom in and out, and also if we hold down middle mouse button, and we can drag around in the same way that it works in the main Maya window. We can right click in open space here, and we get this menu here, which is very similar to some of the options here about frame all and frame selected, which we've got up here as well. So we just really make it a little bit more accessible. We can right click on a node as well. We can show node information, we can rename it or even delete it, and even select the connected nodes upstream and downstream. And that will become clearer once we start building our own graphs. There's even things about naming the display mode as well, whether you want values and names. And again, that will become clear once we start trying to do stuff inside Bifrost itself. Now, another thing you might notice if you open up one of the example graphs, so these windows around some of the graphs, and they're called backdrops. And they're really handy at doing any kind of annotation and grouping nodes together that you want to maybe kind of highlight for some reason. Now, you can create a backdrop here from the main menu, or even right click in a graph here in the main window, create backdrop. And you just get this very simple square, which if you click and drag around it, you can drag to wherever you actually want it to be. Then once you kind of make this larger by clicking on this triangle, you can scale it up. If you double click the triangle there in the bottom right corner, like so, you can change the color of the actual of the window itself. And if you double click inside the backdrop here, the outside now becomes a dotted line. You can actually start typing. So this is really handy if you want to start providing information on your graphs, because the purpose of Bifrost, or one of the main purposes, is to create effects that you can share and distribute to somebody in a team or in a studio. So being able to annotate things and put some information and notes in there is going to be beneficial to anybody opening up the scene for the first time, and they just want to know what it is they're actually looking at. If we double click just inside the window again, that will go solid, and again we can move that around. But then once you move a node inside of this almost encapsulates everything that falls within this border. So now when I click and drag, everything moves around inside it, and if I want to take it out, I can just move it away. So you'll see this inside some of the example scenes. So if I bring up a sample scene now that I had before, let's just import that. It will open up the graph. These are some of the examples here we've got. And again, we can see how they're just there just to give some basic information about what it is I'm looking at, and also explain certain things about, well, click here, this is what this node does, etc. Now, many of these nodes have different points and data types, you might say. But again, if I click on this dummy geometry, you can see I've got more parameters being exposed. And again, the more things I click on, the more information that can be now exposed per node. So you can see there's quite a lot of information here on this scatter radius node. It's all very clear and explanatory. So there's a lot of things to go through here if you want to. Now, there's lots of information about what these ports mean, etc. as well. I'm not going to go through everything right now because that will take too much time, but we'll cover a lot of that stuff in the tutorials as well. It's easier to mention them whilst we go instead of trying to do everything right now. Now, if you wanted to explore any one of the Bifrost examples, there's a few things to look out for and be aware of. I'm going to load in a very simple example here, the smoke trail. And when I load that in, it will load in the graph automatically that we know. So I'm going to just zoom in slightly and just press play. Now, of course, it's just trying to play it on the fly, so the performance isn't going to be great. But we can see we've got a moving sphere, and then we've got some kind of smoke trail coming out the back of it. So it looks pretty good. So if we bring up our graph editor now, so this is the graph that's creating that effect. And what we can now do is we can start to explore it, and this is one of the best ways in which we can learn Bifrost and learn what it's actually doing. Now, this may look a little bit scary and intimidating if you're looking at it for the first time, because you're not always going to know what half these nodes actually do or mean. But that's really fine, because you can just play around with it. You can unplug this stuff and try connecting things up. But also, it can be a good way of just understanding the actual graph itself and the general anatomy of it and what things actually mean. Bifrost is a pure data flow graph. So there's always data flowing through the graph, and it flows, you could say, downstream, but essentially it's left to right. So when you look at any graph in Bifrost, you'll always notice that on the extreme right, there's always this output node. And everything has to go eventually into this output node. This is what Bifrost is doing to essentially execute all these nodes, because this is visual programming. So these nodes essentially represent, you could say, lines of code. If you were to write this out in code or as a script, you'd have to write various lines of parameters and string booleans and all these commands. Well, you can do that in a series of nodes, which is going to be a lot easier for you if you're not particularly skilled at writing scripts, and you just find it easier to work in a more visual way. Now, on the extreme left is where there will usually be an input or any kind of input as to data coming into this graph. And then once you've got data in the graph, then you can begin to manipulate it or do something with it. So we can see here, if we zoom in, the animated sphere. So this is probably the basic thing that's come into the graph, because that's what we want to drive this particle effect from. So that's going to be the starting point. And then from that, we can essentially follow the trail. So we can then say, well, there's two outputs here, and all these nodes can be expanded out. And there's a few options here that you can look at. And you'll begin to pick these up as the more you go into the graph editor. Using the 1, 2, 3 of your keyboard, you can expand or collapse the nodes into different things. So, for example, if I just click this node here and do 1, it will collapse it right down. If I do 2, it will partially expand it, and if I do 3, it will fully expand it, but there isn't much there to really do anything. If I do it with one of these, for example, let's go down to 1 and then 2 and then 3, you can see the differences between the options there. But we can follow the lines and the connections. So we've got this node here, it's going into this node here, vary inherit, and there's also an annotation here which is telling us what exactly it's doing. So this is the inherit velocity that creates the pushback for the smoke trail. So varying it so that it's not constant creates a more turbulent trail. So you've got a very basic explanation there, and when you click it, you've got some parameters that you can change around. And again, just try this out, to try and changing these values and play it back. It might take a while to recache or recalculate each time, but it really is a good way of experimenting. And then here we can follow this one down to here, where this line is going all the way down to this option here. In fact, it's going all the way straight out. So we've got the mesh coming in, and also it's going all the way straight out, but also along the way it's being branched into this tree here. So again, reading from left to right, always start on the left and always eventually end up on the right. So essentially the mesh is going out here, but then along the way the mesh is being used to drive and create and emit the actual effect we want it to. So we've got the fog density there, we've got some kind of source air, which is the try different speed modes to create various trail effects, and again you can experiment there. And then you've got this thing where the actual simulation goes into here, and then there's a file caching option here, and you can start to set the file name and some properties as well, so you can do that. Then you've got an option here to change the mode to enable the file cache. So again, it's clearly an option here to play around with. So again, you may just want to noodle around and just have some fun with it. Even if you don't know what it is you're actually doing, it can be good just to experiment, and you'll begin to get an idea of just how interactive Bifrost can actually be. But it's all about understanding the basic principles of the graph. So there'll always be an output mode node of some kind, and there'll always be some kind of input coming in, and then everything happens in between it. And these nodes essentially act as a series of commands, and then they're finally being executed here. So that was a very basic, simple and high level overview orientation of Bifrost for Maya. I haven't gone too deep into the nodes and all the details yet. We'll do that in the next videos. And in the next video, we're going to be creating our first Bifrost graph and our first Bifrost effect. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you in the next video.